Thank you, everybody. Thank you to NLU for the kind invitation to speak. Really appreciate it, and it's lovely to meet you all. So I'm going to be talking today about security policing between London and Delhi, which I'd like to start off by saying that this is very much a work in progress, and I'm presenting something that's an idea to you, something that I'd really like to put into practice. So I'm really trying to bring all these different strands together, and in that vein I really welcome your discussion, your thoughts on the proposal itself. So what I'll present to you is actually a research proposal that I've worked on in consultation with some colleagues, but something that I'd like to kind of put into practice and work collaboratively, perhaps with colleagues here and in the UK. So just a slight caveat there to begin with, so that you can perhaps talk to me about the viability of the study as well. In terms of what I'd like to cover or try and touch upon today, first of all, I'd like to just talk about some of the global policing challenges that seem to be present in both the UK and India. And we've already talked about those briefly. And then this subject about counter-terrorism in the UK and India. This is a conceptual point I'm interested in, both looking at the two countries separately, but also the level of cooperation or lack of cooperation between the two, and also within the countries themselves. So it's coming at this issue from many different angles, basically. Transnational colonial police relations, which we've mentioned, and then also I'll talk about the methodology and analytical framework which tries to bring all these different ideas, hopefully. And lastly, I'd really like to just talk about a pilot study that I conducted in 2011. I came to Delhi and I conducted a focus group with some police officers, worked with some of the NGOs here, met with people to try and see how this study might work in practice, or if indeed it could. So in terms of the global challenges, of course you know all of this, but the global security landscape changed dramatically following the 2001 terrorist attacks in New York and Washington DC, and also the subsequent atrocities in Madrid, London, Mumbai and elsewhere. So concerns about counter-terrorism and border control in particular seem to have become really heightened since these events. And I think it's fair to say that in contemporary society, counter-terrorism concerns are often conveyed through the discourse of border protection. So it's the mobility of suspect populations that are restricted, and this is often done through immigration law enforcement, and this is obviously a very contentious subject both here and in the UK. And in terms of strategy, there seems to be a real pressure on nation states to cooperate at the interstate level, and to at least show that there are efforts to facilitate global counter-terrorism campaigns, if they can. There seems to be this almost codependency on countries to work together. Thinking about counter-terrorism in the UK and India, and whether and why it's important to think about the two countries. India's obviously witnessed very high levels of terrorist violence, and it's described as a hybrid form of both domestic and international terrorism, in that it features a huge foreign sponsorship of indigenous militants. So I think these are aspects that the UK and India can share in terms of learning knowledge from each other. And based on this, it seems as though Muslim diasporas have been the primary target of counter-terrorism globally. That's somewhat obvious, I think. But what does seem to come out from the literature is that the two countries have fairly diverse counter-terrorism practices and approaches. So So there's a suggestion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but there's a suggestion that India's strategy is to focus on some of the hard measures, so things like physical security at airports, at entrances to public spaces, and so on, and less so on the kind of public, gaining public cooperation as being producers of security. In the UK, there seems to be this much broader approach whereby you have this strategy called the contest strategy, and within that there's this idea of prevent, where the idea is to try and step in before groups become radicalised, or to run counter-radicalisation programs, which I think are not so much implemented here, as far as I know. There have been obviously criticisms on both sides. In amongst India's domestic counter-terrorism regime, it seems as though there's been suggestions that it's destabilised some of the democratic principles, it's fractured community cohesion, and also perpetrated some human rights abuses. And I think the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative has published quite widely on some of the findings here. Also, in terms of the legislation, so the Terrorism, and I always get this wrong, sorry, and Disruptive something Act, sorry. Yes, sorry, the Terrorism and Disruptive Activities Act. When it was in force, it found that lots of the cases were actually withdrawn, I think, because there wasn't enough evidence. And following that, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which, as I understand it, has particularly been criticised for being quite draconian and authorising extensive police powers, lethal force, and a form of kind of political action that's almost corrupt political action that's become normalised in parts of everyday life. I know it was repealed in 2004, but the suggestion is that some of the substantive laws remain intact and in place. So in terms of legislation, that's where the interest is as well, to see how these kind of hard measures work in combination with the idea of the hearts and minds which we have in the UK. So just a very crude kind of comparative visual there, but slightly going back on what I said, the kind of the leaflet from the Delhi police there, seems that there is this move towards engaging the public much more and being vigilant and bringing them into this idea of producing security measures much more. So in terms of seeing why we might be interested in comparison, I think some of the laws, policies and practices could definitely be compared quite fruitfully. And also this notion of the continuum between colonial and post-colonial policing is really important. And as far as I know, in criminology, there's been little uptake of that subject, particularly between India and the UK. And it seems a fairly important historical piece of knowledge to try and gather. So the continuities and discontinuities of order maintenance, we've already mentioned that the British were the people who implemented the police force here, and to see how those antecedent policing institutions continue to have contemporary effects, I think is something that we could usefully look at much more. And why policing borders? So the experience of suspect communities travelling between India and the UK, I think, is important. It seems as though the route from India to the UK provides this convergence almost of migration flows. So from India to Pakistan to the UK, it seems to form this focus point whereby a lot of counter-terrorism concerns are focused and are said to need to be focused. In terms of the study, I think it's one of the things I would be interested in is looking at the process of visa applications and the ways in which these are granted and denied. this has not really been looked at, and I think it has a relative amount of power in terms of understanding processes. So recently, I think it was in 2010, student visas were subject to a blanket ban in the UK because of counter-terrorism fears. I think Muslim students in particular were thought to present a real threat. And this ban was in place for quite some time. I think it was over a year, which obviously you can imagine caused a fair number of problems. And I think the range of controls within this visa process is really interesting to look at. So, for example, they can lead to detention without charge if you don't have the correct visa documentation, deportation orders, and so on. And so it's really important to understand the analysis of policies and decisions to accept and reject applicants in this sense. So moving on to how I want to try and bring this all together conceptually, I've looked to this conceptual model of security policing, which was first proposed by Hocking and Lewis. In this model, what they suggest is that security policing refers to an enmeshing of immigration laws, ordinary policing, and counter-terrorism laws and agency practices, and that it's this enmeshment that we need to understand how that becomes normalised in everyday life and also amongst communities themselves. So I'm not only interested in the legal, the legislative kind of level, but also the lived experience of suspect communities themselves. And also the broader processes of measuring security and law enforcement includes this kind of hybridisation of functions, so hybridisation of intelligence functions, or security archipelagos, which Didier Bigot talks about. So these islands of security, which then somehow are navigated and then become joined or not differently. And within this, obviously, the transnational dimensions of security policing are important here to look at India and UK in particular. So theoretically, what underscores this kind of project of mine is this idea of the criminalisation, the othering of Muslim communities, which is really key in the UK. We have this focus on the idea of homegrown terrorism, particularly at the moment, and it's an issue that India's been looking at quite carefully for a number of years, and so I think there are important crossovers there. So in trying to put it really simply, this is my aim. And so to understand the intersection between border protection, domestic law enforcement, and to do that through this empirical study of security policing. And I've made a diagram which hopefully clarifies it a little bit. I'll talk you through it just quickly. So the strand 1 at the top delineates the legal and political context within which security policing is said to occur. So within this, I'd look at the relevance of European law, policing and security policy arrangements in relation to counter-terrorism and immigration controls in the UK and India. The second strand looks at the security policing in the communities within India, and specifically looking at the experience of Muslim groups in India. And this would be the aim, the ideal type would be to have case studies whereby we have interviews conducted with people themselves to see how they feel subject to ordinary policing and counter-terrorism and also border patrols within that. And strand 3 simply is a mirror of the India case study, which I've conducted in London. And lastly, at the bottom, the fourth strand aims to look at the impact of transnational security cooperation. So to see how that's working in terms of the two countries speaking to each other or not in working towards preventing terrorism. The security policing practices that I'd look at within the study would be things like passenger profiling of people before arrival, pre-entry clearance once they land in the UK or India, decisions to deny or grant visas, entry and residence, also border agency powers to detain and question people, to see how those work differently or similarly in the two countries, and to deny entry and to deport. I think I've covered the research questions, but just to give you a summary of them. So, as I've emphasised at the top level, looking at the kind of legislative ties between the two, but also how security policing is actually experienced by the suspect communities living in the two places. I would just, it's fairly self-explanatory, so my methodology and analytical framework would be to conduct in-depth interviews with the police, to also form a comparative legal database. It seems that there's not much comparison between Indian and UK legislation. I think it would be interesting to form a database which actually looks at these two countries in comparison, and which gathers all the cases, so they can easily do research, and also interviews with suspect communities themselves. I'm just really briefly going to highlight some of the key themes that emerged from my pilot work, and I'd like to present these really very tentatively, so they're just themes that I haven't been able to go into in too much depth. So one of the first things that really struck me, and this is both in the UK and India, but particularly so in India, was the performative nature of security checks, and almost displays of security as being as if not more important than the actual security itself. So the need to feel secure as you're going through a hotel, rather than actually checking diligently how, who's going through and who's not, for example. Also, it seemed as though security producers were almost immediately thought to be suspect, which I thought was quite interesting. So anecdotal stories about things going missing in hotels and so on, the immediate concern or questions were raised at security guards, at people who are working in the hotels themselves, who on the one hand are there to provide and produce security, but on the other hand immediately suspect should something go wrong. And also these heightened, from talking to communities themselves, how the implementation of counter-terrorism measures actually heightened fears of insecurity outside the secure enclaves. So this kind of imaginary boundary that people think that they're stepping in and out of, which was really interesting, I think. And perhaps lastly, just quite an intuitive point, but just as policing, intelligence and migration control practices are thought to be enmeshed in security policing, I found that comments from the agency personnel that so had the sources of insecurity, so perceived risks of crime, political violence, petty crimes as well, seem to all kind of coalesce around this notion of people who are suspected immediately, particularly those racialised as the other, and almost acted as a basis for establishing social distinctions and profiling, allowing profile categories. I should say in both sites it was quite clear that the Muslim group was demarcated as the other, as suspect. I'm not going to talk about this in too much detail. Okay, perfect. This notion of securitisation is something I'm quite interested in. So the experience of being a securitised citizen is thought to be quite gendered. So in the UK particular, it seemed to be around forms of dress. So forms of dress were a form of disciplining technology, so used to mark out Muslims as being insufficiently British, for example. And what some scholars have talked about is that in particular in Britain, British Asian Muslims are now securitized citizens. And what this means is that groups are talked about and immediately there's this connection that they form a security threat. The idea is that there's a straightforward idea that they form a risk, they represent a risk without that kind of in-between suspension of judgment. And theoretically there are questions about whether securitized citizens represent a different experience from people who are racialized, who are treated in a racist way. So it seems as though white Muslims, for example, as well, felt subject to this othering process, which somewhat complicates this idea of simply interpreting it through a racist lens. The counter-terrorism policing practices, so in the UK we had fairly draconian laws. We had Section 44 of the Terrorism Act, through which police officers could stop and search individuals without the need for reasonable suspicion. Although that was withdrawn, in some empirical work I did at the time, it found that British Asian groups were very much subject to being stopped and searched under Section 44 and felt profiled. And this formed quite strong intra-ethnic boundaries between groups. So talking to young Sikh boys, for example, in London, they would really want to emphasise how angry they were that they were stopped and searched because they felt as though they'd been labelled as Muslim. I don't know if you know that after the London terrorist attacks, some were wearing T-shirts saying "Don't free, come Sikh," and it's interesting the kind of boundaries, the intra-ethnic as well as inter-ethnic boundaries that are reinforced through these counter-terrorism strategies. Transnational masculinities and discussions of home. I think there's a real transnational dimension to understanding British Asian masculinities. Often they'll talk about India, Pakistan, without having even been there. So there's this imagination, or they'll talk about references their parents have made, notions of belonging based on the idea of a place rather than actually having been there, and cultural passing on. Monotony, which perhaps seems a bit strange there, but one of the things that seem to cross both countries, the monotony that counter-terrorism police officers really felt in doing what they were doing, in providing security. And something I've already mentioned here is that paradoxically places of heightened security and police presence were also felt to be the most insecure places. People being very worried at airport borders and so on. So I'm going to finish there. My final point is just to kind of underscore the real value, I think, in looking at South Asian diasporas within this framework of security processes and security policing. The real value in learning from the two countries and learning along the continuum as well. And just to reiterate that point, I think the UK-India relationship provides an example where security cooperation has been prioritised against the backdrop of historical continuity and contemporary change as well. And just lastly, I'd just like to say thank you, and just thank all the people who helped with the pilot work and also just getting ideas off the ground. Thank you.
To introduce Professor Logan while they do a little dance around the wires here so that I don't delay you any further. Professor Logan has been with the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford for almost 10 years, and in that time and the time before that at other universities in the UK, he's managed to produce some 6 monograph monographs and 2 edited collections. So you see, he's quite, thank you. I'm no good at technology. He's quite a prolific writer, and he's written about many different topics, but most currently writing on a project called A Better Politics of Crime, which is concerned, I think, with the different dimensions of the relationship between crime, control and democratic politics. So his research, like his teaching, looks both at crime, criminal justice and the sort of political framework within which that takes place. His presentation today is called Private Security and Regulatory Space in Search of the Public Interest.
Thank you very much. Let me first just echo the thanks to my colleagues for both the invitation and for your very kind and generous hospitality. It's been a long cherished ambition of mine to come to India, so this is far good an opportunity to pass up. Before I start, I should also just correct a couple of potentially misleading impressions. Caroline, in her introduction this morning, said I was the only member of our party who could claim to be a lawyer, and I kind of feel a complete confession is required at this point. The complete confession is I have a 28-year-old law degree, and as I discovered in life, there's few things more useless than a neglected old law degree. So I was once taught law. That gave the impression I was rather closer to your concerns than I in fact are. The other clear misimpression I want to clear up is I appear to have the title and a paper which is the most remote from the stated objectives of this conference, as was alluded to at the outset. So the impression the misleading impression I want to clear up here, just by way of starting, is to suggest a number of reasons why it's not as remote as it might at first seem, and I think there are 3. Firstly, it seems to me, and a number of other people who work on criminal justice and policing these days, that you really don't do adequacy to the world in which we live if you just study the processes of state ordering and justice. In other words, in many, many jurisdictions across the world, of which mine is one, and I rather suspect yours is another, policing, protection, security, justice is not just a concern of state institutions, but is increasingly a concern of actors whose services are purchased through mechanisms of market exchange. And I think that's incumbent on us, therefore, to think not only about the relationship, not only about state and non-state justice, but also increasingly about the enmeshing of public and private policing and justice systems. The second reason for thinking this is close that you might first imagine to the concerns of the conference is that, particularly the way I want to think about it, the private security raises a series of issues to do with regulation, to do with legal reform, of a similar kind to those that one would engage in if one was thinking about how you go about rectifying questions of failure and wrongdoing inside state criminal justice system. And thirdly, it strikes me that what private security does is raise very explicitly, at least if you think about it properly, raise very explicitly a set of questions that are sometimes buried in discussions of state criminal justice. And these are a set of questions basically about distributional justice, about the idea and the problem of how the benefits and burdens of ordering and policing and justice systems actually get distributed as between individuals and groups, and in what kind of relationship to the risk that different individuals and groups differentially face. The other thing I just want to say by way of a prefatory remark, and I'm not the respondent. I'm going to be my own respondent. That's just not the thing you do, is it? But it does strike me sitting there that the one thing that we are all illustrating is different stages of the empirical research process. So Caroline is someone who's deep in the middle of it, and Alka is someone who's trying to get a project off the ground. I'm about to give you a paper which is, in a sense, to some extent, about a project that I've just completed on the market for security products and services, but also an attempt to kind of use that research to kind of revisit an old debate and to think about it, hopefully, in some new ways. And that old debate is a debate about the regulation of the private security industry. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. It doesn't need to labour the point that the private security, in all its various guises, from guarded labouring through to technologies, through to its involvement in various kinds of security policing, is a fast-growing industry. I tried to do a little bit of background research on private security in India, to which I discovered two things. One, that there's almost nothing written about private security India. So if anybody is searching around for a research project in the room, come and talk to me afterwards. I also managed to discover that the best estimate is there are 5 million people in this country working in the private security industry in various guises. And private security brings to its customers a number of stated advantages in terms of expertise, in terms of dedicated service, in terms of accountability to customers, but also, in my judgment, raises a series of what you might call public interest considerations. In other words, the more that the market for policing becomes a market, the more that there is a risk that resources are distributed in inverse relationship to people's actual vulnerability to victimisation. The more there is a risk that the private markets and security chip away at the kind of collective commitments to collectively, as it were, funding and providing security as a public good. And the more that you think about private security in these ways, the more it acquires what John Dewey fantastically called a public capacity. In other words, it becomes a legitimate interest of all citizens, not merely of those who engage in the buying and selling of goods inside that industry. So the question that we've been forced to revisit on the basis of the research that I'll mention briefly is how can you better align on the assumption that it's not going to go away, and there may be even no good normative reasons why you would entirely want private security to go away. Given that it's here to say, how can you better align the private security industry with considerations of the public interest? And the reason for thinking about this as a regulatory question was our dissatisfaction with the way in which private security regulation actually gets discussed in the existing literature. Now, in that literature, we think you can find two dominant models for the sake of simplicity, one of which we call the idea of cleansing markets, the other one which seeks to communalise markets. I'll say more about these in a small while. For our point of view, what these two, in many ways very different models share in common is a kind of a set of standard neoclassical assumptions about how markets for security work. In other words, they assume that people who are buying and selling security goods are, as they would for any other market, rational, calculating, egoistic, seekers after their own interests, who are somehow lifted from any kind of moral or political or social or cultural context, which may in some way shape the ways in which they behave in those markets, and indeed their inclination to enter or not enter those markets in the first place. Our research, at the hour here is myself and my co-author who works at the University of York. Our respective research over different projects over recent years has led us to challenge this view, because both of our studies of private security in the UK have demonstrated that this in fact is a market that in all kinds of ways is shot through with moral and political considerations of various kinds. In other words, when people think about whether or not to buy security, they're not solely thinking about, can I afford this, will it offer me protection, but in some, their minds are also full of a series of considerations to do with the relationship between the potential purchase of this particular product, say a GPS tracker or a hired guard, and a series of other things about which they care, which are to do with relationships of mutual trust, of privacy, of solidarity, of conceptions of community, and so forth. I've got my glass on, but I can't read the thing I wrote about 10 minutes ago. In other words, the security markets are a market in which market and non-market considerations are always in some sense colliding, and where the decision to purchase products are always in some sense shaped by non-market values. Furthermore, that specifically in relation to the security industry, we're talking about a market in which the players involved are in some sense deeply embedded in long-standing processes of state building, in which the idea that security is delivered equally to all, what we call the modern democratic promise of security, is somehow also imbued in people who are trying to seek to sell or buy additional alternative forms of provision. Now, thinking about that security in those terms, as it were, as a moral economy, has led us to approach the question of regulation in a slightly different way, and to try and find ways of thinking about how to harness those non-market values in the way in which the private security industry is regulated. In other words, how can we regulate security in ways that honours these plurality of understandings that shape the market? A factor which seems to me to lead you towards a form of regulation which isn't about just trying to control the market failure, to producing efficiency, to dealing with just the quality of goods, but also trying to preserve and give expression to and protect the range of non-market, otherwise political and social values that the security industry impinges on. Furthermore, just by way of introduction, it seems to me that the other thing we've been trying to do is to try and connect the debate that currently takes place about private security regulation to a much wider, and I've discovered huge and sometimes rather tedious literature on regulation more broadly conceived. But from that literature we've taken three things which we want to build into the model that we are trying to develop. Firstly, the now close to being axiomatic claim that regulation is decentered. In other words, that a model of regulation which just assumes that the state is the regulator and it exists in a kind of command and control relationship with the industry or the companies they're trying to regulate, has long since been jettisoned in favour of a much broader notion of regulatory space, which one encompasses a whole range of different state and non-state actors in the regulatory process, and doesn't think the regulatory relationship just goes one way, in other words, from the state to the market. Secondly, we've taken on board the idea that there is no single regulatory template which you can kind of carry around with you and just plonk down on any market activity you want to regulate. But you need to tailor regulatory strategies and tools to the peculiarities of the market you're trying to understand and control. And secondly, that any regulatory activity requires some clarity as to the goals and values of regulation. In other words, one needs to provide a kind of clear and cogent answer to the question, why are you trying to regulate this industry and for what purpose? Now, it's with that in mind that I want to both talk about two existing models of regulation as a kind of ground clearing exercise, as a prelude to trying to introduce and kind of articulate the merits of, shall I say, our third preferred alternative. Now, the reason I don't have a PowerPoint is for all the reasons to do with technological failure that you just had illustrated to you, and because we've achieved the remarkable feat of reducing a 10,000 word paper to one table, which you can all find on page 94. So I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes basically elaborating on that table, and if you prefer to have some notes to follow, that's the place to look. Right, the default model in the discussion of private security regulation, we have re-described. I should make it clear that these are our terms, not the terms of the people associated with these models, described as trying to cleanse markets. This is very much the default position in the literature. As I've stated already, it rests upon a series of neoclassical assumptions to do with the fact that buyers and sellers voluntarily enter markets, have information available, take rational calculating decisions, and so on and so forth. And that the problems and, as it were, the public interest issues that arise in relation to markets occur insofar as the security market doesn't operate in those ways. And three particular problems are articulated within this model, which a system of regulation has to deal with. Firstly, the widespread recognition that security is a grudge purchase, by which I mean we found this in our research as well and tried to deepen our understanding of it, that people don't buy security in the way that they buy clothes. That security is a form of consumption that people are in some sense dragged to, sometimes by the stipulations of insurance companies, sometimes by health and safety regulation, sometimes by the experience of victimization which they don't want to be repeated. And that grudging nature of purchase creates an industry, and this is particularly acute in the guarded security sector, in which there's a deep reluctance to believe that you can pay more for more quality, and a market which is extremely price sensitive, which makes it, the people who are selling those goods, extremely cutthroat and competitive. This, the argument runs, tends to generate an industry with fairly low standards, with fairly poor staff, with low pay, with a great deal of churn, and so on and so forth. And this leaves the market open to what the British scholar Mark Button calls deviant influences. In other words, a whole series of kind of recurring problems to do with malpractice, fraud, corruption, false arrest, poor training, and so on and so forth, which have now become recurrent findings of anyone who does work on private security. Now, the solution to this problem inside the cleansing model is, firstly, it's interesting to note, focused on sellers, not buyers, a point to which I'm concerned, and does cleave to that assumption about regulation, which I previously just indicated was somehow now considered rather antiquated. In other words, this is a kind of state-centered solution. The cleansing model continues to operate on the idea that the state is the principal regulator, and through a series of command and control, basically through the issuing of rules, that it can bring the industry into line. And the particular form this has taken across increasing parts of the world in recent decades has been the introduction of state licensing systems. In other words, it says if you as an individual or you as a company want to operate as a private security industry, you need to obtain a license from the state, and therefore you need to meet certain minimum requirements in terms of training of staff, in terms of criminal record background checks, and so on and so forth. And through these means, the industry can be cleansed, hence our title, of its deviant operators. Now, with that in mind, what those working in the cleansing tradition, if you like, have done in recent years is two things really. One, to kind of do a kind of collation job, to look around the world and just compare and contrast different kinds of licensing regimes. And as I note in the paper, there's a recent UN document which has kind of put all this stuff together. And secondly, to kind of to go through those existing regimes and try to identify what you might call forms of best practice, and then try and generate models of regulation on that basis. But that regulatory model is always takes the similar kind of form. In other words, to try and regulate just enough to cleanse the industry of its deviant influences, but not so much that it becomes an excessive regulatory burden. Now, in all kinds of ways, this is a valuable way of thinking about the regulation of the industry. It's no part of our case to say that somehow licensing is doesn't have its place, needs to be jettisoned. There is also some evidence it does work. That, it does exercise a kind of cleansing function if you get effective state licensing systems in place. But nonetheless, there are some limits, and I'll briefly just mention three. Firstly, within the cleansing model, there is almost no attention paid to the kind of distributional issues involved in the emergence of private security, nor of the kind of relationship you might want, and any attention to the relationship between private security and the practices and values of democracy. In other words, regulation here, it's about correcting for market failure and nothing else. Secondly, as mentioned, it's all very centred and rule-based. In other words, so if you think about regulation as a kind of space involving a number of actors, then the cleansing model doesn't mobilise many of those actors in the regulatory process. And thirdly, it's very conservative. I suppose it depends on your point of view whether you think this is a good thing or a less good thing. By which I mean that its kind of stated reform agenda is to find the kind of the best that's currently happening somewhere in the world and to try and spread it. As if the best that we can hope for in social and physical life is the best that we can currently identify in some place in the world. Right, secondly, we're now in the middle of the table. What we call here the communalising model also rests on a series of neoclassical assumptions about how market works, but in almost every other respect differs from the cleansing model. It differs in the following way. Firstly, it is focused on problems of distribution. Secondly, it seeks to empower buyers rather than curbing sellers. Thirdly, it's decentered, radically decentered in the way I'll demonstrate shortly. Thirdly, it brings questions of democracy, and in particular the attempt to involve local communities in deliberative democratic practice around how security is delivered, makes that central to the business of regulating security. Fifthly, when you start saying fifthly, lists are getting too long, aren't they? Anyway, I'm nearly finished. It's not conservative, far from it, but is engaged in a practice of trying to radically realign the relationship between states and markets. And finally, it forms part of a much wider conceptual framework, which has become known as nodal governance, through which you need to understand the particular regulatory strategy which emerges here. This requires me to spend 2 minutes on nodal governance. Nodal governance is a body of work in the security literature associated principally with Clifford Shearing of the University of Cape Town and many of his other colleagues, who in the 1990s and 2000s really made the following claims. Firstly, they made an empirical claim to the effect that if you're studying policing and security, you should no longer assume that the state is the major player in the game. And in particular, either in providing security or regulating it. And certainly you should no longer treat that as somehow a starting assumption for doing research or thinking about any kind of policing and security issue. But should instead treat that as an empirical question. In other words, in any particular jurisdiction, you should just damn well find out who are the major players and providers in any particular nexus. And in this context, these Shearing and his colleagues become particularly interested in what they call nodes, by which they mean quite small locations. They could be shopping malls or leisure complexes or gated communities or universities, all of which are in some sense now in the business of sourcing or providing or regulating their own forms of security, hence the term nodal governance. Now, on top of that principally descriptive claim about how the world is, it rests a kind of normative claim that forms of nodal security are in some sense better for the denizens of particular nodes than old-fashioned forms of state-centered security. And this all rests on a kind of borrowing of the kind of Hayekian, let's not put that so familiarly, the critique made by the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek of states as opposed to markets. And Hayek's claim was that remote state officials lack the knowledge and the ability to discover the knowledge to be able to respond effectively to the needs of individuals and communities. And this can be done much better through the mechanism of markets and prices and so on and so forth. And the extension of this that the nodal governance theorists make is that those operating within particular nodes are much better able to articulate and understand and source their own forms of security than simply relying upon remote bureaucratic organisations. Now the problem that arises in this context is that form of nodal kind of decentered security, as Shearing and Bailey point out, actually generate a whole series of unequal distributions. In other words, the well-financed, well-to-do nodes with large amounts of social and political capital are able in this world to generate for themselves much greater forms of protection than, for example, poor communities. Now the solution that one finds within this form of regulation is not, as neoliberals would have it, to treat this as just a natural order of things, or as many liberals and social democrats would try to do, just to try and reassert the authority of the state over the world of policing and security, but instead to empower buyers. In other words, to try and find a way of communalising security markets so that they could meet the needs of poor as well as rich communities. A particular mechanism that Shearing and Bailey have found for doing this is through a system of what they call block grants. In other words, involving often local state actors, giving local communities a kind of security pot which they can decide how to spend as they see fit. Now, as stated at the outset, I think this model has various kinds of advantages in terms of involving a whole series of new actors in regulatory space, in the kind of encouragement of democratic participation in how that block grant gets spent, for example, but continues to do, well, it's two features. One, it's entirely focused on buyers and not sellers. So there's a kind of unstated assumption that under this communalised market, sellers will kind of come to the ball, if you like. And it continues to rest on a whole series of assumptions of a neoclassical kind about how markets work. How long have I got?
7 minutes.
I'm unlikely to need all 7. Okay, right, finally. We should be clear that in making this third proposal, we have no ambition to somehow kind of wipe the field clean so that we can entirely occupy it with this kind of new model of regulating private security. In many ways, what we propose is an attempt to kind of keep in place and build upon some of the insights and regulatory regimes that have been generated on the back of what we're calling the cleansing and communalising approach. But nonetheless, we want to endeavour to provide a kind of a model of regulating private security which is in some sense a genuine alternative and which has its ambition, as we put it, to civilise markets, by which we mean an attempt to try and reap the benefits that private security can bring, as described at the outset, but to try and situate private security in a regulatory space in such a way as it doesn't threaten the egalitarian project of providing equal protection for all. And it in some way exists in a greater degree of alignment with the various kinds of non-market values, trust, solidarity, human rights, which in various occasions private security can threaten. So the question is, how can you realign regulatory space in order to try and do that? And I'll just say a few words about that. Now the first thing to say, and this is where my thinking on this has really been a product of this research project, which I'm going to just place in the background for the moment, which has kind of changed the way in which I think we should think about how security markets work. and has developed, in my mind, the idea that they are forms of moral economies. And I think this is true both among buyers. We've had various forms of evidence about the ways in which, as I said at the outset, various kinds of non-market considerations to do with, well, what effect will buying a GPS tracker have on my relationships with my children, or what does living in a gated community say about the relationship, about the kind of country I live in, about the kind of neighbourhood it is, and so on and so forth. I could go on chapter and verse on that. Perhaps more surprisingly, we also found that moral ambivalence about security among those who sell security. So if you sit down and, or if you read the trade press in the UK, or you sit down and talk to security sellers, two things become very apparent. Firstly is they will go on endlessly about how the industry is full of people who are sullying its reputation, about selling bad products, about not properly regulated, they're not charging a high enough price. In other words, there's this kind of widespread recognition that it's never the person you're speaking to who's making this claim, but that other people in the industry are somehow tainting it. So it's a slight stretch to say that this is an industry marked by self-loathing, but it is an industry marked by a remarkable degree of kind of ongoing critique of other players in that industry damaging its reputation. The other striking thing you find when you talk to people who sell the security industry is how often, or how infrequently they use what you might call market-based legitimations to describe what they do. In other words, they rarely say we're generating wealth, we're providing jobs, we're doing all the kind of things that the private industry does. Instead, they borrow from other kinds of non-market legitimations. One of which, and there's many of which we described in a recent paper, one of which is to try and borrow the symbolic authority of the police. In other words, in terms of the uniforms, in terms of making marketing use of police credentials, in terms of trying to improve their relationships, and so on and so forth. All of which suggests that in all kinds of ways that moral ambivalence about the idea that security can be something that can be sold finds its way into the dispositions and sentiments and practices of the people who are engaged in selling it. Now, the lesson we draw from that finding is twofold. Firstly, that we shouldn't treat security markets, and therefore the private security industry, as just a form of standard consensual market exchange, but instead as a form of social ordering. In other words, a practice of governance that is deeply implicated within modern forms of security, and in some sense an ever-present threat, to a greater or lesser extent, to security's modern democratic promise, the idea of equal protection for all. And then secondly, that if you think about the security industry as a form of moral economy, that the idea of regulation is no longer just about trying to impose something on that market from the outside, but trying to harness a series of sentiments that are already present among the buyers and sellers of these goods. In other words, you can address the private security industry not simply as economic actors, I'm not trying to say they're not economic actors, but also as moral actors. Now, what we draw from this is a model of what we describe as democratic guardianship, which is a model which seeks to somehow protect the idea of equal protection under conditions where security and policing is going to be provided by multiple providers. And I don't want to give you chapter and verse on what this might look like, but just say a few things just to finish off. Firstly, that our model is one which tries to involve both buyers and sellers, not just buyers or sellers in the other two. Secondly, it's not a model principally organised around rules. In other words, we've largely moved beyond that kind of command and control conception of regulation towards one which makes much more room for principles, for trying to find appropriate principles through which regulatory space can be structured. Now, there's a long discussion in the regulation literature about the effective worth of rules and principles, which I don't need to bore you with now. There is a time and a place and a space for rules, but rules also have a number of well-known disadvantages. They create perverse incentives, they encourage people who are subject to rule regimes they don't believe in to engage in forms of gaming. The appearance of rules being followed is very manufacturing certain forms. There's 30 years of police sociology I would wheel out at this point to demonstrate that point. And in that context, there seems to me to be space in how you regulate private security for trying to articulate, to trying to use principles as one of your regulatory tools. Now, the point about a principle, as John Braithwaite points out, is it stipulates a goal without telling those who are being regulated how are they to go about meeting that goal. and by so doing invites them to become participants in articulating how it is that particular goal should actually be met. And that's essentially what principles do within regulatory space. They actually make those being regulated not simply the subject of regulatory control, but they try and involve them as partners in a regulatory conversation. Now, in that context, we could have a long discussion and no doubt disagreement about the appropriate principles that might one use for trying to civilise security markets. The suggestion we make in the paper is you might want to reorient regulatory space around two. Firstly, a principle of public deliberation. In other words, the idea that the regulatory actors are involved in trying to foster and sustain an ongoing public dialogue, not only about how this industry and how it's working, but about its appropriate reach and limits, and about the kind of meanings and sources of security, where the legitimate participants in that discussion are not just the people who buy and sell these goods and services, but all of us as citizens. And secondly, a principle of solidarity, which is basically a way of saying that we need to find a kind of regulatory regime which attends to and makes central to what it does the kinds of distributional effects of markets in security devices, and which treats the tracking and monitoring, and if necessary the repair of those distribution injustices as part of what regulation is about. Now, there's a final part of the paper, for those of you who've read it, in which we just try and sketch, and it's very much a rough guide, of how you might reconstitute a series of relationships inside regulatory space between the security industry and regulators, between the industry and police, involving the role of trade associations, about how you might mobilise civil society, in which we kind of sketch how you might kind of reorient regulatory space in order to give effect to this principle of democratic guardianship, as we so call it. But if you want to talk about that, we'll do it in discussion, and I'll stop there. Thank you.